Hi there, everyone. My name is Max Young, and I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of Vroman's Bookstore to tonight's virtual event. Tonight, we are lucky to have with us author William Loving in conversation with Chip Jacobs, discussing William's first book, City of Angles. We're so grateful that you can make it tonight and that you're able to continue supporting our bookstore through this time. Tonight's event does include a Q&A portion, so if you would like to ask Bill a question at any point in the event, you can go ahead and click the Ask a Question button towards the bottom, and they'll go ahead and get to that like 40 minutes into the conversation. Also, if you would like to purchase Bill's book, go ahead and click this green button down here, and you can go ahead and purchase it from our website. But with that all out of the way, I will go ahead and introduce our guest for tonight. First, we have with us William Loving. I'll go ahead and refer to him as Bill from now on. Bill is a former newspaper reporter and editor at the Los Angeles Times, Minneapolis Star Tribune, Providence Journal, and Connecticut Post. Raised in Baltimore, Maryland, he now lives in Pasadena, and City of Angles is his first novel. And with him is Chip Jacobs, a Los Angeles area author and journalist. His debut novel, Arroyo, is a Los Angeles Times bestseller and medaled at the Independent Publisher Book Awards. His reporting has appeared in the Los Angeles Times, LA Weekly, the New York Times, CNN, Bloomberg View, as well as many others. But with that all out of the way, I will go ahead and let them take over now. Thank you all so much.
All right, Bill.
Chip, I want to start out by saying thanks for being here with me. I really appreciate it. I think this is a perfect example of how authors in our Southern California literary community really do support each other, which is a great thing, and I really appreciate you being here tonight. And I also want to say thank you to Vromans for hosting this and giving us this platform and giving me a chance to talk about my book. And it's another great reminder to support your local bookstores like Vroman's. Vroman's has been a real center of literary life in Pasadena and this whole part of Los Angeles. So support your local bookstore.
Well, I second that. Bill, thank you so much for letting me go embark in conversation with you. I'll just tell the audience quickly how I learned about Bill's book. I was doing a Zoom book club for my novel, and I get an email a few days later from somebody I never met. Turns out Bill and I have a mutual friend named David Willman, who's a Pulitzer-winning former LA Times reporter. Bill worked with him in DC. He was sort of my mentor when I was a cub reporter. So Bill asked me if I would read his novel. I said, for sure. I'm always interested to see what other people are doing. And, authors are a little bit like musicians. We get a little territorial. And if we see somebody else who's developed a really good hook or catchy, we get a little envious. Like, darn, I wish I would have come up with that. Bill's writing shines from the first paragraph. And, he describes a hotel that's the center of the action in such beautiful language. And at this point, I knew this is somebody, whose work was destined to be an important part of the Los Angeles canon. And if I can just read one paragraph or one sentence, it just tells you, in talking about this hotel that's somewhat like the Hotel Green, he says, the Casa Grande moved apart, proud in her old age, wearing her elaborate facade like a Victorian dress, buttoned up to the neck over a corseted waist. I mean, it was just such a slick, evocative allegory. I knew I was in for a treat. So, Bill, thank you for writing what you did. My question out of the gate is, how did you work in a sense of place when you were developing the idea for City of Angles?
That's a great place to start because place is really important to me in this book. I sort of view Southern California as a stealth main character in this book. It's really as much a character as the main human character, Homer Innes. So, and we start out at this so-called Casa Grande apartment building, which is based on the old Green Hotel, now known as the Castle Green in Pasadena, which is really a remarkable antique. And I tried to capture that by comparing it to an old Victorian woman. So I thought before we get too much into the questions, I might do a short reading just to kind of illustrate the importance of place in this book. And this is a section, this is a brief read, I won't drone on too long, where the main character, Homer Innes, who has become homeless through a series of calamities, is traveling through Los Angeles trying to find his runaway teenage son. And he and his father-in-law, who he can't stand, but they're kind of in this together, are just at Griffith Park. From Innes's perch on the observation deck of the Griffith Observatory, the Los Angeles basin stretched to the east, south, and west. From the San Gabriel Mountains to the humpback Palos Verdes Peninsula to the Pacific Ocean at Santa Monica, 50 miles from end to end. The morning after a rain, as the sun returned, the air was clear of smog, the San Gabriels dusted with fresh snow, and a silvery strip of the Pacific shimmered in the distance. He traced the north-south boulevards of the city, Vermont, Normandy, Western, as they parallaxed southward for 35 miles, straight as rifle shots, all the way to the harbor. Small planes and helicopters silently glided by, looking like toys as they passed the glass towers of downtown. Clusters of more office towers formed replicant downtowns from Hollywood to Mid-Wilshire to Century City, creating a vertiginous lack of center. A soft murmur of traffic and city life rose from the basin floor, faint and pleasant from the heights of the observatory. It reminded him of the comforting sound of a loved one in sleep. Up close, Los Angeles often looked gritty, garish, and disorienting to him. An endless graffiti-covered polyglot grid of double-decker mini-malls, nail salons, muffler shops, taco stands, burger joints, food trucks, billboards. Exhaust from cars and buses and traffic jams fouling the air under constant drone of helicopters overhead. From his distant vantage, it all faded into the background of the city's setting of mountains and hills, valleys and canyons, sandy coastline and bile green sea stretching to the western horizon. Los Angeles lay before him, forbidding and enticing at the same time. Somewhere out there in that immense expanse, he hoped, was his son. So
wow. Yeah, that's very not only just really finely rendered writing, but it's so visceral. And, you know, you are describing Los Angeles as seen through the eyes of your character. And you do create some order out of the chaos that is the checkerboard floor of our city. How long did it take you to write that little passage?
Not long at all. Wow. I have to say that's in there mainly because that is one of my absolute favorite places in Los Angeles. Yeah. The observation deck of the Griffith Observatory on a clear day, when you can see all the way to Long Beach Harbor and from the mountains to Santa Monica, it's just breathtaking. You take in the entire magnificent expanse of Los Angeles, and you see it in its geographic setting of mountains and canyons and hillsides and valleys and coastline, and you're out of the city far enough so you don't feel that kind of, you know, crazy crowded urbanness of down on the street level. So I love it, and I had to get that in the book somehow. Yeah. So I've been there many times, and when I pictured the character Innes there, I could just write it. It was very easy. It just came to me because I've admired that view so many times.
Yeah, it's organic. You didn't like jump on Wikipedia or go to some other site and go, how can I recreate being above, you know, the thrum? You had so many choices, like any novelist, to you know, have a central theme. You know, somebody once said, you know, there's only two types of story. A person takes a journey, or a person's a stranger in a strange land. Actually, you accomplish both in your book. But you make the moral center of your story homelessness. You know, I feel they've been overshadowed by the pandemic, by the chaos in DC, racial strife. But if you took the LA Coliseum, you could fill it 2/3 full with people that don't have homes, and it, it is a disgrace, and there doesn't seem to be an easy solution. Why did you, decide to make homelessness, really sort of the centerpiece of action?
Yeah, well, the book is about a lot of things. I think if I succeeded at what I was attempting, it exists on a lot of different levels, and it's set largely among the homeless population, but it's not strictly about homelessness. But nevertheless, it was something that I just felt like I needed to comment on somehow. And what started the idea for me was the Great Recession of 2008, when I started seeing a lot more homeless people in my neighborhoods in Pasadena and all over Los Angeles. I mean, the homeless have been with us for forever, it seems like. I mean, Skid Row in downtown LA is over 100 years old. But typically the chronic homeless that we've been used to seeing for a long time, and we usually look past, suddenly I started seeing a lot more people out there in street corners holding signs begging, who looked like they'd only recently become homeless. And these looked like people who had jobs and places to live just, maybe a few weeks or months ago. And I found it very alarming and very disturbing. And I wondered who these people are and what their story is. And I started wondering, what if that was me?
Yes.
How would I cope with that kind of a situation? What would I learn about myself? What would I learn about the world? To have all that stripped away from you. So that was kind of the germ of the idea. And I started thinking, I really would like to explore this, and a novel seems to be the best way to do it.
A novel versus an expose or a feature piece for the Atlantic. So, I mean, it's, you took on a difficult challenge because, you are delving into a subject that is painful for people to think about, and maybe we blot it out, and it's so hard, you sort of avert your eyes, although we need to. So why a novel? I mean, did it fit the framework of fiction?
Well, yeah, journalism would have been an obvious choice. I spent almost 30 years of my life in newspapers. But I felt like there wasn't much I could add journalistically. For one thing, my former colleagues at the LA Times have been doing just a fantastic job for years covering the homelessness crisis in Los Angeles. And I didn't think I could add anything that they hadn't already said so brilliantly. So that's why I thought a novel would be a good way to approach it. That way I could maybe control the elements and the scenes, the narrative, and kind of shape it to say what I think needs to be said on many different levels. And plus, I just felt like a novel was something I wanted to try to do.
Plus, with a novel, you can complete character stories, whereas if you were jumping in for a couple days at Skid Row, are you really going to know somebody's arc? So, it never feels artificial. It feels like, you're watching somebody on an Odyssey, which brings me into my next question about the Odyssey. So the framework of your book really derives from the classic poem by Virgil, the poem Aeneid, right? And, it took a lot of courage to do that. I mean, almost like taking Shakespeare and trying to modernize it in a passion play. So, can you just briefly remind people tuning in, about Virgil and about the poem and what grabbed you about it, that you would juxtapose some of the elements?
Yeah. Well, Virgil's Aeneid is an epic poem from the Roman Empire era, 2,000 years old. It has a lot of similarities to Homer's Odyssey and Homer's Iliad. In fact, he borrowed heavily from the Greek epic poet, but it's not nearly as well known as the Odyssey. I think you typically don't come across the Aeneid unless you're studying Latin or
Yeah.
classic Roman literature. And I did have Latin in high school, and I was familiar with the Aeneid, and I had reread it in translation as an adult. And when I was thinking about a book about homelessness, it's occurred to me that the Aeneid is essentially about homelessness, because it takes place in the wake of the Trojan War, as chronicled by Homer in the Iliad. After the Trojan War, when the Greeks sack and burn Troy, the prince Aeneas manages to escape. He's one of the Trojans who survives. They escape on a ship, and they spend the whole epic poem sailing around the Mediterranean, looking for a new home and trying to find a place that will take them in. And it just said to myself, what a great classical historic template to use as inspiration, jumping off point for a book about contemporary homelessness in Los Angeles.
Yes, and people think Homer, the only interesting permutation of Homer is Homer Simpson, which parenthetically came from Nathaniel West in Day of the Locust. But I found it really interesting, and it wasn't just the element of losing his home. There's other elements of the poem in your book. Can you tell people about where else? Because I think it's fascinating. What else did you borrow, quote unquote, from the book?
Well, without giving away too much.
Yeah, of course, no spoiler.
Obviously, I mean, one of the reasons I used the Aeneid as an inspiration, kind of almost a template, not exactly, was because I wanted to explore in what way that ancient classic literature still has application to today's world in terms of its commentary on the human condition. So I was obviously not going to replicate the entire poem. That would be impossible and would be dumb. So there were certain highlights from the Aeneid that I wanted to try to make sure are represented in my book. And in doing that, it allowed me to explore this idea of what about events in the human condition 2,000 years ago in the Roman Empire that are in that poem are still relevant today and still make sense being carried 2,000 years forward. Certainly there's a scene where it's early in the book, so it's not a spoiler. The apartment building where Homer lives with his wife and teenage son is burned down by an arsonist. And it's a terrible thing. And especially when I think that it's the building is based on the Castle Green in Pasadena. And it was so upsetting to me, the idea that I burned it down, that I changed the name in the book to the Casa Grande.
The tenants appreciate that as well.
Yeah, I'm sure. So that is right out of the Aeneid. That's the burning of Troy. And the people who escape are kind of like the modern day equivalents of Aeneas and his band of refugees.
And there is without giving too much away, there is a migration that follows somewhat Aeneas during his flight. I maybe go back and want to read more. And also it's kind of interesting, Virgil might have had a claim of a little plagiarism against Homer. Thank God there's not that, site today. I think to me, this book had been living in you since you took that Latin class, and it's just been fermenting for a lot of years, And so did you have an aha moment when you thought, oh my gosh, part of something that I'm passionate about can play into a new work of art?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've for a long time, I'm a pretty voracious reader, like most writers are. And I've especially enjoyed retellings of the classics, which is a long and proud tradition in literature. Some of the books that I really enjoyed were Jane Smiley's book, 1,000 Acres, which is a retelling of Shakespeare's King Lear moved to a farm in Iowa, for example. And Charles Fraser's Cold Mountain is a Civil War take on Homer's Odyssey. And I think that's fascinating. And I wanted to try to do that myself.
Well, I think you accomplished that and more. So let me ask you. So, I mean, there's other literary references in this book. I mean, you have James Joyce, you have Robert Penn, you have Warren. You know, I think it's reflecting, you know, your hunger for literature. You know, but you know, are people picking up on these references? I mean, I try to sprinkle Led Zeppelin in my book, little here and there. I'm not sure everybody got it, but are people picking are bookaholics like us picking up on your references? It's kind of like little treasures you've left along the path.
I think that's a good way to put it. I call them Easter eggs.
Yeah.
You know, like in video games where, you know, you hit a certain place in the video game and something pops up on the screen that has nothing to do with the game, and the game designer stuck it in there just for grins and to give you something to smile about. So I wove a few of those in the book, and my feeling is if you recognize them and get a smile of recognition from it, great. If you don't, hopefully you don't even notice and it just go right over it, and it's well integrated enough into the book that it doesn't seem forced.
Yeah.
But I really wanted to acknowledge the debt I have to, you know, the writers who inspired me. You know, I've been reading novels since I was a teenager, and there are certain books and certain authors that really formed my view of writing and literature. And I just wanted to, and, you know, all writers were all inspired by other writers.
For sure.
I just kind of wanted to be a little bit more open about some of the ones that inspired me and give them a little tip of the hat in my book.
I feel like it's well said. I feel like as a former reporter, it took me a while to bleed out of myself newspaper jargon, grammatical construction, especially, you know, dependent clauses, you know, a little breathlessness. You know, I feel like the best newspapers let their writers' voices come through, but that doesn't always happen. Did it take a while for you to develop a voice? And specifically, how long before you were Homer, before you were seeing the world through his eyes?
I haven't really thought about me as Homer. I mean, to be honest, at the very beginning of the book, Homer, there are some of me, some of my life story in Homer, just in the beginning, and then his life goes in a very different direction than mine. Thank goodness.
Yeah.
So mostly his journey through LA just started playing in my mind almost like a movie. And I wasn't necessarily seeing it through his eyes. It was like I was watching this character going through the city and hitting all these different neighborhoods and having these encounters with people, some bizarre encounters, some I hope funny, some rather tragic. And I got kind of swept away by the story rather than kind of imagining myself as Homer, which I couldn't really quite do.
Yeah.
Because I haven't lived that experience.
You haven't lived that experience, but you have lived the experience of being in LA. And what I really like about the book is, you know, it's busting out of Pasadena, and we are experiencing other parts of, you know, the metropolis. I mean, we go to West Hollywood, we go to, you know, the Triangle, Beverly Hills, Bel Air area, you know, off to the coast. You know, I mean, there is a bit of a travelogue, and I feel like you're seeing Los Angeles as she is, not Los Angeles as she's presented, sparkling and beautiful when there's some NBA game, you know, and they show the Santa Monica Pier. You know, I mean, how much of that came from just you being here, and how much of it came from the necessity for your character to get out of his comfort zone?
Well, I did want to send him on a journey. In that respect, it is a classic journey story. And because, you know, I was trying to sort of echo the Aeneid in somewhat, which is an east to west journey from Troy, which is on the west coast of Turkey and ends up in Italy. And so I started in Pasadena and end up in Malibu. And it's not exactly the same path, but it's similar. And then as far as the places that the characters go through, what the neighborhoods, I chose those deliberately, and I wanted to convey Los Angeles as I understand it.
Yes.
It was kind of a personal street level view of the city in which I've lived in for over 20 years. And I'm not a native, so I still kind of have that visitor perspective on LA, but I've been here long enough that it's really seeped into my pores. So I wanted to hit some places that are not well known, like Frogtown,
Right.
and Skid Row. And I wanted to avoid a lot of the cliches like surfers and movie stars and film directors and things like that. And show that LA is mostly just ordinary people struggling to get through the day and get through their lives.
I think you exemplified that. I mean, there's scenes where Homer is having pretty interesting conversations with a pair of prostitutes. He winds up on the West Side in the most unpredictable romance you could imagine. And it felt, I mean, it was, sometimes I was so, I so engaged in some parts of his journey, like he was on a switchback, and I almost wanted to stay. Like, what happens, with his relationship with this woman? And you don't make it superficial, And so I feel like you're not just having little cameos and position pieces, So how did you figure out who he was going to interact with to help him remember why he's homeless in the first place?
Well, in fiction, as you know, Chip, it's one of the challenges is making all the characters three-dimensional, and believable and unique as people inhabiting their own lives, who just kind of happen to enter the screen of your story. So I based some of the characters very much on people I've met or seen around Los Angeles. A lot of the characters in there are amalgamations or direct representations of people I've seen around town. Some of them, I have to say, are also characters in the poem, the Aeneid. And there are a handful of key supporting characters in that poem that I said they just got to be in this book. And so some of the characters are lifted out of the poem, but most of them, I would say, are inventions of my own, based on people I've seen or known around town.
So I did the same thing in my novel, where I took people I met as a reporter or just know my personal life. I distorted them. I changed some elements. Has anybody, called you or emailed you and said, Bill, I'm on page 140. Has anybody picked out themselves or seen a silhouette of somebody else they know in your book?
No. No one has yet.
Okay.
Or
be grateful.
If they have, they haven't shared it with me. But yeah, I mean, one of the things that I have heard, which is kind of interesting, is this question of verisimilitude as far as exact, precise accuracy about Los Angeles. And I tried to be accurate. I wanted it to seem like the real Los Angeles, but because it's fiction, I also felt like I had the license and the right to vary some of the details, like the name of the hotel in Pasadena, the apartment building in Pasadena that burns down. And there are some characters in there who are pretty recognizable, but I changed their names. And I really enjoyed your book, Arroyo, and you had real historical characters in that book interacting with made-up characters.
True.
Right. So how did you approach that? I mean, how did you decide to put Teddy Roosevelt and Upton Sinclair in a book about a fictional character?
I did a lot of research. I found that those two were big fans of Pasadena, were here often. And, I guess it's the contrarian in me. There's sort of this idea in historical novels, that you can't have a famous person in there. And that's too hackneyed or too easy. But I felt like they're part of, they were part of the sculptors of Pasadena and the myth. And so, I added them in there and I tried to make them only present when they are moving along my characters, but I had a blast. I loved Upton Sinclair when I was in high school. Teddy Roosevelt might be one of my favorite presidents. And so to miss the chance to have them in there and also get to research, I just, I couldn't pass it up. You don't have, really, you don't need to because your novel's so strong. You don't really have, historical figures in your book, but you are relying on some classic history, sort of as touchstones in there. So, I mean, I want to ask, were there times when you had to beat the old journalist out of you to write free, to write creatively, to break the rules of grammar, to, curse? I mean, was that hard as somebody who was a lifelong journalist?
Yeah, I mean, the daily newspaper training I found to be both a help and a hindrance in writing a novel for the first time. A lot of reporters and journalists have written novels, so it's fairly common, as you know.
Yes.
But I found the discipline of sitting down at the keyboard and just typing every day. You learn that in newspapers, right? I mean, there's no such thing as writer's block in a daily newspaper. You just sit down and you start doing it. So I didn't have really any problem actually being productive in writing the book. But especially early on, I did feel that my first drafts, the prose was maybe a little stiff.
Right.
And I said, I need to tap into my inner creative writer here, because I have not. I've not studied creative writing. I didn't go and get an MFA in creative writing. So all, my training is daily journalism, and my instinct in writing is to err on the side of clarity rather than on the side of lyricism or mystery, like a lot of great poets and fiction writers can do. I guess that's just not me. So I can live with that.
You may not have an MFA, but the younger you was devouring books. So
Yeah.
that was your MFA. That was your English, coursework to me. Nobody was saying, Bill, read Shakespeare and, Mark Twain, F. Scott Fitzgerald, one of my favorite writers. You just had that natural fire in you. So I'm not surprised you wrote something like this. To me, I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say that I think there is no better training for a writer than to read great books, great novels. And I lost track, a couple hundred, 300 novels over the years. And there's just no way that those didn't somehow seep into my, subconsciousness. That kind of the rhythm of good prose, it just kind of comes.
I know. And I feel, well, after I read, somebody who's just immensely talented and has such an original idea, I feel so motivated. Not that I want to outdo them, but I feel like it's motivating me to tap into myself, to something I haven't extracted yet. I do want to make a comment about your main character. You said, what if it happened to me? I don't think Homer's life was going as great as the optics would suggest. In fact, I mean, when we discuss it, I think the man, was a bit sleepwalking through his existence, and it's so common for somebody to take for tragedy to clarify that he he was sort of a ghost to himself. Was that hard to tease in, and make people realize, what he lost within himself wasn't as harsh as what he lost outside.
Well, I think Homer Innes's character arc, his story from the beginning of the end of the book, is really the heart and soul of the book. I mean, it happens to be set among the homeless population, and I hope that readers read it are as outraged about homelessness as I am once they read the book. But it's really about one person's kind of arc, their journey from, he starts out as a somewhat self-satisfied, entitled, college-educated suburban white dude. He is already on hard times when the book opens because he's been affected by the Great Recession. So when a calamity strikes, he quickly finds himself on the downward slide, and then suddenly he's one of them, one of those people that he always looked down on from his lofty perch in Pasadena. And he has to learn how to cope with that, and he has to learn how to let other people guide him and advise him. He's very stubborn in the beginning part of the book, and he just has to learn empathy and interdependence, and he just has to really open his eyes to the world around him.
Well, he does. To me, my favorite part of the book is the most frenetic step in his journey, where you don't know whether insanity is engulfing him or whether our creator is shining a light to him. I just thought it was so well done. I was almost getting emotional because you were showing a human being coming apart or coming together at a cellular level. Was that difficult? I mean, you love Homer, but we need to see him have a real low, and boy, he was below the curve on this one.
Yeah, I definitely made him suffer, and I apologize for that, Homer V. Innes, wherever you are. There is a scene, it's a brief section of the book where he's clearly losing his mind, and I tried to I never had a psychotic break myself, but I've seen people who have, and so I tried to show that this guy has been through a horrific experience, and what he has is maybe something related to post-traumatic stress disorder, and he makes a lot of bad decisions throughout his journey across LA. Very questionable decisions, and he makes things worse a lot. And and people see that a lot. We see people making bad decisions and ending up in bad places, and it's easy for us to say, personal responsibility, you're making bad decisions, but sometimes they're made under mental duress, and whether it's depression or PTSD or just some kind of terrible calamity, people will make bad decisions, and he made quite a few.
Yes, and also the old idea there, but the grace of God. In Pasadena, on the homeless front, I went to the market, and I noticed this woman slumped up against the wall, and she was filthy. She was down on her luck. She had a violin case. She pulled, at one point, this lady was going to be a musician. She opens up the violin case, and her pet rat is in there.
Wow.
And, I was so angry about this. I almost had tears coming out of my eyes. When I gave her money, I didn't give her my time, but I gave her money out of liberal guilt. But it's, I don't think this woman invited demons into her head, but there was still humanity in her. That rat probably was as important to her as her mother used to be. So, I think you wrote something, that deserves to be, recognized as a very important book. the book world is an interesting place that wants to pick winners and losers. I often think, but great writing and great ideas still stand the test of time. Everybody wants to have a prestige read, but I would rather read a read that's comes from the heart and was many years in development. A lot of times I think bands, their first album is their best album because they've been practicing and developing and they're not under the pressure, and so you're going to have big shoes to fill, homers, when you come along your next one. So that leads to one of my last questions. So what are you cooking up next? Because I will be consuming it. So what's going on in terms of number 2?
Well, I'd love to be able to tell you that I have a second book almost done and ready to come out next year, but I actually have about a half dozen ideas for books that I'm really interested in, and all in their own way. They're all very different. They're not like City of Angles. So some of them I've actually started. Some of them are just up here. Some of them I've sketched out some outlines on, and I just need one of them to step forward and say, "Write me," which is what happened with City of Angles. I mean, that story took shape in my mind. It would not let me alone. I mean, it just I could not write the book because it was driving me crazy, and so I'm waiting for that next book to emerge, and that's my goal for next year. Actually, once I get past this sort of pandemic book tour, and put City of Angles behind me, starting in January next year, I really want to get going on the next book, and so you'll just have to wait and see.
We'll have to see which one step forward.
Yeah.
If anybody wants to ask a question of Bill, I really encourage you to about Homer. We can just keep talking, but we'd love to hear what you have to say. Somebody already popped up, a viewer named Julie, saying she never thought of Aeneid, in terms, I don't know if she's read the book or in terms of a story idea. Does anybody else want to ask about a plot point or, why Bill picked a certain location? And if not, we'll just keep talking. So please let us know. Anyone? Sometimes people can be a little shy. So, okay. Well, please, while you're listening, just type something up and I will go and check out, who's doing what. So can you, just talking more, did you feel that you had to treat Pasadena with any kid gloves when you were writing that scene because you live in the city? Pasadena is a proud town. They're very protective of their image. They sort of don't like sarcasm, as I learned in my book, and that's okay. But did you take any steps to try to, I don't know, make sure you weren't, cornered on Colorado Boulevard? Or did you just, it didn't matter?
Well, because I live here and my book is set in the present, I was careful not to have any recognizable Pasadena characters in it, prominent Pasadena residents. All the characters there's a group of characters who live in Pasadena who were introduced in the first couple of chapters, and they all live in that same building that burns down. And you follow them, not only the main character, but these other friends of his who lost their homes. They're all, just completely made up figments of my imagination. And then the book leaves Pasadena fairly early on, and only returns in one scene toward the end.
It does.
I didn't like in your book, Arroyo, that the whole thing takes place in Pasadena,
pretty much,
and in 1913 mostly, and so you really went right up on against Pasadena, and it's very interesting history,
right?
So it's kind of different for me because I skated by it pretty quickly and managed. I think I hopefully avoided angering anybody, and again, I'm really sorry about burning down the Castle Green.
Yeah, I have one person in Pasadena that doesn't speak to me anymore because I did emulate a character off him, and where I thought I saw nobility in what he did, he just saw, caricature. So smart move, Bill. So questions are definitely popping up. So first of all, somebody wanted to know, how did you come up with the title? Was that your inspiration? Was it your publishers? What informed that decision?
Well, my working title when I started this book project way back in 2016 was City of Angels, which of course is a cliche that's way overused.
Yep.
It was just a working title. And then I workshopped it with some writers groups over time, and I changed it numerous times. And I had, at one point, I had called it City of Fire and Rain, which I kind of liked until someone pointed out that it sounded like the next book in the Game of Thrones series.
I was going to say.
So I said, no, let's not do that.
Jon Snow's busy.
And so then this idea, well, what if I would go back to City of Angels, but twist it a little bit and just flip those two letters around and turn angels into angles and capture this kind of double entendre that everyone in LA's got an angle, maybe, or
screenplay.
Yeah, and I actually ended up putting that line in the book. There's there's a line where somebody is being kind of Pollyanna-ish and hopeful about Los Angeles and said, well, after all, this is the city of angels. And this other cynic says, yeah, it's more like the city of angles when you really get down to it. People tend to look out for their own interests. So that's what I ended up sticking with for the title.
Yeah. And have anybody read it wrong and said City of Angels, and you have to be pretty polite and not correct them in an embarrassing fashion, but
Several times, actually, people have referred to it as City of Angels.
Yeah. I have a question from David. Question for both authors. As long-time Pasadena residents, what characteristics do you think make Pasadena unique? And what makes Pasadena stand apart from Southern California in general? What do you think?
Yeah, I think Pasadena has a vibe. Yeah, I think Pasadena has a very different vibe than most of the rest of Southern California. And I noticed that moving here. My wife and our kids and I moved here from Minnesota in 1998. And we spent a lot of time exploring the area, looking for a place to live and send our kids to school and worry about my commute to the LA Times building in downtown. And we were looking in Orange County, we were looking in the Valley, we were looking all over the place. And Pasadena struck me as, wow, this does not look like Los Angeles at all. This has got all these kind of neoclassical style government buildings with a kind of Spanish-Mexican hint to it. It had a grandeur to it. And I realized that there's this history of it being a resort town for wealthy people in the 1890s. People from the Midwest who built kind of a replica of a grand, wide boulevard Midwestern city right here in LA that to me just doesn't look or feel like any other town in Southern California.
I agree.
What do you
think? Yes, I mean, you have lingering influences of Millionaires Row and, a cultural, sensibility that you don't find elsewhere with museums. Of course, you have Caltech and JPL. You've got the self-perpetuating public relations apparatus known as the Rose Parade and the Rose Bowl. And in a way, Pasadena was fortunate being across the Arroyo Seco because it differentiated. It's like now you're coming to a different area. But Pasadena, unlike LA, never seems chaotic. It feels orderly and noble and maybe a little aloof, but it's it's a pretty magnificent place, and they guard that image like some, bank guards, protect jewels.
I like the way in Arroyo you talked about building the Colorado Street Bridge. in 1912 and 13, that there was concern that there's going to link Pasadena to Los Angeles.
Yep.
Right? It was like, we've got this beautiful Arroyo Seco, this canyon separating us from the rest of LA, and you want to put a bridge across so they can just drive across the bridge and come to Pasadena? Why would we do that?
Yeah, well, the automobile industrial complex wanted that, and
Right.
people wanted investment and mobility. So questions are popping up, and it's great.
Okay.
Somebody, Julie Martin said, she read the Aeneid long ago when she studied Latin, and then parts of it in translation. And she said she'd seen Aeneas in groups as refugees, but not part of a homeless population. So, I mean, I think she is connecting, her school days and education to, understanding, this is literature that you've, put in a modern setting. Somebody else said,
I think that.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to just answer what she brings up a really good point, in that technically Aeneas and his fellow Trojans were refugees. They were war refugees. And that would also, the Aeneid would be a great template for a global refugee story set in contemporary times, because the global refugee crisis actually dwarfs the homelessness crisis that we have in our country.
For sure. And I would say to you as well, we think we saw a refugee crisis as ISIS took over parts of the Middle East. Well, wait till climate change really starts cooking.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to see that's going to look like a trickle, So refugee stories are going to be, maybe the story of our age, I think.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I would be equipped to write that story because it's so far beyond my experience.
Yeah.
But I did read a great refugee novel recently called Exit West, which I would highly recommend. And I know there's a whole developing of refugee-oriented kind of diaspora literature that's being written right now.
Yes, and in many ways, even stories
Other questions?
Of prophets are about refugees. Somebody said, Kathy said, on the flip side of your book titles, Wayfarer's Chapel and Palos Verdes used to have a sign in their parking lot. Park at an angle, or park at an angel, always a favorite for our family. So do you know about this, the Wayfarer's Chapel in Palos Verdes? And the sign?
No, that's very clever. Park at an angel. Very nice.
So I mean, I just want to ask you in our dwindling time, the west side of Los Angeles plays an important element here. And, we've all heard about the People's Republic of Santa Monica. We've also heard the term limousine liberal. Where did that come from? Because, when you present these cities, I feel like you present them the way the Chamber of Commerce would denigrate, but there was a raw honesty about it. Had you had experience out there? Had you just consumed news about it?
Well, a lot of it was just news, what I've read and absorbed through other sources. And, I did, as I said, I scoped out the whole journey path of this book several times, driving around, getting out of my car, walking around, taking pictures, taking notes, and just gathering information. And I really wanted to avoid caricaturing anybody or any place. So I tried to capture some of the smugness and sometimes I guess I would call it callousness of parts of our, not just Los Angeles, it's everywhere. But I also didn't want to be completely dismissive. So I think I tried to represent places like Venice and Santa Monica and Malibu as conflicted, about the homeless. That, it's a tragedy and it's a stain on our beautiful palm tree paradise, but as long as they're not near me, let's do something about it.
That's one of the subtle messages of your book about NIMBYism. And I personally feel NIMBYism is at the root of a lot of our homeless problems, as well as others, affordable housing. People talk a good game and they make a donation or they vote a certain way, but are you really going to be okay if there's, a halfway house, on a suburban block? I mean, if we're really all in this together, then we're going to have to swallow that NIMBY complex, and so in that way, it was very relevant. I mean, Pasadena, we see it as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I also wanted to be careful to not come off as trying to solve the homeless crisis. This is a novel. It's not a policy paper.
Right.
And, I don't have the answers. There are some ideas that I find intriguing and worth doing, but I know that the political will is very difficult. It's a heavy lift. And, but, and I don't have the answers. What I was hoping to do with this book is see that we're asking the right questions and that we're at least paying attention and starting to see these people not as just these shambling wrecks sleeping on benches, but as as human beings
and our neighbors, and there for the grace of God. Poor Homer can tell you, that ground underneath your feet isn't always as stable as it might appear. So, does anybody else have any other questions or comments about City of Angles? I mean, it's a heck of a good book. And I'm not even getting any cut off the commission. I'll just tell you, it's to me, one of the surprise reads of 2020. It truly is. And so I will take that compliment and turn it into a pitch for small presses. Mm-hmm. My book was published by an independent press in New York City, not one of the big, giant corporate conglomerate publishing houses that dominates books. And, as Chip was just saying, a lot of the most interesting reads that are out there today are published by small presses who will take a chance on something that doesn't maybe fit the current book publishing industry zeitgeist on what sells, right.
Like thrillers with the word girl in the title, for example.
That's true.
Those are like slam dunks. I mean, guaranteed big book contract. So small presses, I really believe in them. And along with independent bookstores like Vroman's, in small presses, I just hope people will support that part of the book industry.
I wholly back that statement. I went with more of a medium-sized independent publisher, but they're not, some monolithic, establishment that you can never get anybody to call you back. Vroman's, Vroman's is part of like the muscle tissue of Pasadena. And when I saw that message saying, they needed all hands on deck, I clenched. I can't think of Pasadena without Vroman's. And I actually went back and did research for Arroyo. And man, AC Vroman was, he was not just a businessman. He was a creative person. He was a photographer, nature photographer. He had his own origin story. He didn't just sell books when he came out. Seeing those old pictures of Vroman are really enthralling, and you can transport yourself back. And the fact that they've, in the age of Jeff Bezos, been thriving until the pandemic is a remarkable achievement, and I feel like that's, in a way, our literary Castle Green. We cannot let it, let it teeter. So,
in fact, they put out, this is a kind of a nice way to combine these two things. The local homeless support organization that my wife and I support as Union Station Homeless Services in Pasadena, and they've put out a call for contributions for Christmas gifts for their homeless families, and especially children's books. So I'm going to Vroman's tomorrow to load up on children's books and then dropping them off at Union Station. And I encourage people to think that way.
I think that's fantastic. If nothing else, in the adult world, we have to think about children, especially around Christmas. I think we're coming sort of to the end of the talk. Does anybody have any other questions or comments, or you want to ask more about Homer's favorite, I don't know, his favorite band, or parts of the Aeneid that Bill might have worked in again. So ask away. And there's Max, and he's going to be our answer man.
Howdy, howdy. Yeah, so we're gonna go ahead and wrap it up there. Bill, Chip, you were both fantastic. Thank you so much. Everyone in the audience, thank you all for joining and contributing your questions. Again, if you'd like to support Bill as well as Vroman, you can go ahead and purchase his book by clicking the green button down below. And I think we do have in stock Arroyo, Chip's book, so you can go ahead and purchase that from our store as well. But with that all out of the way, thank you all so much, and I hope you all have a good night.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
City of
everybody.
Angles. Get that book. Bye, everybody.